humanitarian agencies such as the Red Cross for the last several years in determining how to develop anticipatory action, particularly on what forecasts we might use and which triggers we might set to act on those forecasts. But forecasting depends on drivers. Being able to anticipate things depends on the relationship between predictable drivers and local impacts. And so here we're going to talk about the key drivers of regional climate over Eastern and Southern Africa. So my agenda here is a three-part. The first, I want to go over the main drivers, key drivers of rainfall in the region. And it's useful to illustrate what happened during previous events. So we'll look at some previous events, and then take a step forward to look at how those drivers are evolving this year and what could happen. And I would say this, so the scope of what I'm talking about is what is the remaining months of this year. So from now until the end of December. In particular, the October-December short rains season in East Africa, and the start of the rainfall season in Southern Africa. What I decided it was too much to include to focus on the long rains, since this is not our focus season. And we've had in the last ICPAC webinar, we had Chris Funk talking about the drivers of that long range season, because that long range is an emerging complex picture. And so I decided I will focus here on the imminent seasons here and the likely impacts of El Niño. So let's start with El Niño, ENSO, the El Niño Southern Oscillation. So this is a real key driver of seasonal climate variability worldwide. And what we're looking at the picture here, we can see an example of El Niño moving from neutral conditions back to La Niña conditions back to neutral, back to El Niño. And this is something, El Niño is something that's occurring in the Pacific Ocean and the atmosphere over the Pacific. So you can see a conveyor belt here in the atmosphere. We call it a double-sided conveyor belt with some deep convection in the middle. We call that the Walker circulation. And normally that big area of deep convection, thunderstorms, loss of rain, it's located over the West Pacific, Indonesia and north and northeast of Australia. Normally it's located there. But then sometimes the whole atmosphere ocean shifts. Things build up in the way that the temperature and the sea height of the Pacific Ocean changes, so that there suddenly becomes a large amount of warming in the east, central and east Pacific in the ocean. That weakens the winds, and the result is that deep convection area moves eastwards, moves towards the center and towards the east of the Pacific. And we call that an El Niño event. And when that happens, it's associated with warm seas in the east, cool in the west, and a big shift to that Walker circulation. The opposite is true with La Niña. La Niña is more of a re-establishment and a strengthening of the typical conditions, but El Niño is something different. So El Niño is a big shift and a big push to the tropical circulation, and that has huge downstream impacts across the tropics and further afield. These are typical impacts are shown here. This is just a schematic. This isn't a guarantee of what would happen, but when you get an El Niño event, this is the kind of picture you might expect to see. So just focusing on Africa, in a typically wet, when there's an El Niño in the October to the following January. In the Southern Africa, it tends to be dry from November to the following March. And there's also a signal from a dry signal for the Sahelian region in northern in Sudan and northern Ethiopia, in the unimodal part of Ethiopia, where there's just a season from June, July, August, September. So when there's an active El Niño, what it does, it pushes rainfall towards this. It's not a guarantee, but it increases the chance. It also tends to lead to warmer than average conditions. So El Niño generally increases temperatures everywhere. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. So this is our schematic for over Africa. When there's an El Niño, we might expect wetter from October to December, drier from October to March in the south, and drier in the Sahelian region. That's El Niño. The other crucial driver, particularly for East Africa, is the Indian Ocean Dipole. Now, this is something that looks a little bit similar to El Niño, but it's in the Indian Ocean. So we have a similar Walker circulation with if you look at the left plot, we tend to have that rising air, that deep convection in the West Pacific and over Indonesia. That leads to upward motion, which turns westward as it nears the top of the atmosphere, and it decreases it, and it goes downwards over East Africa. That normal phase tends to lead to subsidence over East Africa and generally a dry climate. But when there's a positive Indian Ocean dipole, we tend to have a warmer ocean temperatures in the west and cooler in the east, and those cool temperatures act to suppress that convection in the east, but the warm temperatures in the west really increase it. So when you get that positive phase, that normal Walker circulation can be really weakened and in some cases reversed, and so suddenly over East Africa we get a lot more convection and rainfall. So when the IOD, the Indian Ocean Dipole, is in a positive phase, we expect much more rainfall over East Africa. These two things are really intricately linked. So they don't occur, ENSO and IOD are not completely independent. They're not completely dependent though. When there's an El Niño, we tend to get a positive IOD, but we can get El Niño without a positive IOD, without a strong positive IOD, like we saw in 2015. And a positive IOD can occur without a strong El Niño, such as 2019. I'll talk some more about that later. But we have looked at the impact of these two phenomena is actually quite complex on East Africa. The most simplest thing is when there's an El Niño and it drives a positive IOD, that tends to bring large magnitude rainfall anomalies across the whole region. This dashed blue line here, you can see in this schematic here. When there's a El Niño and a positive IOD, we get a big wet signal everywhere. We saw that in 1997. That was a typical huge event, lots of rainfall and flooding. But when we get an El Niño, but it doesn't lead to a positive IOD, the signal seems to be quite much weaker. So if you get an El Niño event occurring and the IOD, the Indian Ocean Dipole, doesn't respond in the expected way, we may not see as big wet signal as we might expect. There is some suggestion we found in this paper here that when that occurs, when you get these independent El Niño events without an IOD, there's more of a dipole. The wet signal is restricted to the coast and it actually tends to be drier inland. Well, that's when there's no response from the Indian Ocean Dipole. But then if we take the flip situation, if an IOD occurs, a positive IOD occurs, and there's no ENSO activity, when it occurs completely independently, we still see a big wet signal. So our understanding is that the really wettest seasons are driven directly by the IOD, and they're linked to El Niño because El Niño drives IOD. When El Niño occurs and there's no IOD activity, there's much weaker signal on the wet. So El Niño is not a guarantee of a wet short rains, but it is makes it much more likely. Now, moving to, I should mention with the IOD, so this has been mostly focused on Eastern Africa, and that's because the IOD relationship with Southern Africa is really not as clear. We don't, in big IOD events such as 97, we haven't really seen much impact on dry in Southern Africa, yet we do see a strong El Niño impact. So in Southern Africa, El Niño, we expect a drying, but what the IOD does is more independent with the Southern Africa rainfall. So in terms of the overall seasonal total, how much rain is going to fall between October and December, El Niño and IOD are the key things to watch. These are the big hitters. Of course, as you know, as anyone knows who lives in the region, rainfall doesn't occur every single day, even during the wet season. We can get periods when it's wetter than average or it's dry. Even in the wettest seasons, there are breaks when there's no rain occurring at all. And sometimes that kind of behavior is relatively unpredictable, but we also do find that there is something else which drives those week-to-week variations of rainfall in the season. We call that sub-seasonal variability. And the big hitter there on that timescale is something called the MJO. MJO stands for Madden Julian Oscillation, and you can see a schematic of it here. So we have what we're looking at here. This is the tropics. We have Africa over here in the west, in the left part of the picture, and it's an animation. So what we're saying here, this is a moving phenomenon. It doesn't stay, it doesn't occur in the same place like we see with ENSO and IOD. It moves in the tropics. So these blue areas are where you get more rain, and red are where you get less rain. And it moves as it moves. So this is what we call the MJO. It's an organized system of convection. So organized in that it has a structure. So it has a structure which persists for many, many days, and it has a characteristic way of moving. It moves eastwards. And we've diagnosed the MJO as having certain phases. Phase 1 is when the convection is mostly over Western Africa. Phase 2, 3, 4, where it moves over into the Indian Ocean. And then phases 5, 6, 7, 8 are where that convection moves all the way over into the Pacific. And that convection, so the blue area where there's more convection, more clouds, more rainfall, that is followed by this drier area. So you get this characteristic wet and then dry. And this is what we're seeing here is an MJO, which is active, but it's not always active. So this is not always occurring. This is obviously a simplification. Sometimes it's not active at all, but sometimes it is strongly active. So it can be active and it can move. And it's actually predictable. It's possible to anticipate how strong the MJO will be and where it will be and how fast it will go over the next few weeks. This gives us an opportunity for some prediction, and I'll talk a bit more about this. What are the impacts on the region? Well, there were some limited impacts on Southern Africa because, as you can see, most of the activity of MJO is focused on a band around the equator. But that means it has very strong impacts on East Africa. So we can see some of those here, where what we're looking at is the average rainfall anomaly, so greater or wetter or drier than normal, according to when the MJO is active and it's in a particular zone. So zone 1 on the left through to zone 8 on the right. And what we find here in some of the, in particular in zones 2, 3, and 4, we see the impact of that MJO passing through. So if we, depending on where you are in East Africa, of course, but if we just look at in Kenya, in this border of Mandera around Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, in zone 2, when MJO is active there, we see some impact on rainfall in that region. When it's in zone 3, we see a large impact on the west in Western Kenya. And in zone 4, that wet signal seems to be more in southern Kenya and down into Tanzania. But when it moves into zone 5, we expect drier. So when it moves into zone 5, suddenly it can suppress rainfall and we don't see anything. We can see drier weeks even within a wet season. Zone 6, the same, and then 7 and 8 there, and back to 1, the impact is lower. And this is just one analysis of one particular data set. There's uncertainties here. This isn't a definitive high resolution picture of where the MJO will have impacts, but it gives a general idea, which is consistent with other studies, that when the MJO is in 2, 3, or 4 zone, we expect it to be wetter than normal in the region. This is something we've seen in when we looked in with work led by Mary Clavey at KMD. We had a look at this 2018 season. I'm looking this is at the long range, which was the wettest season at the time, certainly the wettest long range. And here I'm showing, this is looking at Kenya, and we're looking at every single day in the season, from 1st of March in the top left to the 31st of May in the bottom right. This is showing the total, each map shows the total rainfall. And you can see, even though it was a very wet season, there were many days where most of the country saw no rain at all. And what I've highlighted here in the red are those periods where it was very wet and there was a very strong MJO in zone 3. So that MJO activity was driving a wet signal in those weeks. Of course, it's not always the case. Sometimes we see later on in March there was still MJO remained in zone 3, but the rainfall wasn't as strong in most of the country. And other times there is rainfall occurring without that MJO activity. So the MJO, in the same way as the IOD and ENSO, is no guarantee. When you say that El Niño is happening, it's no guarantee that it will be wet. When there's an MJO in zone 3, there's no guarantee that week will be wet. But it's shifting the risk, it's shifting the odds. And that's what we're talking about here. We're forecasting, and we can never give a definitive 100% prediction, but we're telling we can say something about how likely an event is and how likely it might be given certain conditions. Okay, so those are the drivers. El Niño, IOD, MJO. There are other factors and other things which may be important, and there's active and ongoing scientific study to tease out what other influences might be there. But really, those are the big hitters. Those are the things where you don't need to do a lot of work to see that those are having a strong impact. But they don't always have the same impact. So this is why it's illustrative, I thought, here to look at what happened during past events. So this is ENSO. We're just thinking about ENSO here to keep it simple. This is the history of ENSO. When it's red, from 1980 or so up to relatively present day. When it's red, it's an El Niño event, and when it's blue, it's a La Niña. And you can see there's a few big spikes: 1982, and 1997, 2015. Those three big events. And let's have a look at what happened. What was the rainfall looking like in those periods? First, with 1982, we see a typical the El Niño. So what I've shown here is that the rainfall on the bottom, and at the top, I'm showing what the El Niño during OND was, and the rank. So the index was 2.13, but the rank was the third. It was the third strongest El Niño since 1981. From 1981 to present, it ranks third. And I've done the same for the IOD. So there, the IOD was 0.29 average. It was the seventh, so not the strongest there, but we saw a large wet signal. So where it's blue, it's wetter than normal. Where it's sort of orangey red, brown, it's drier than normal. So we see wetter than normal in East Africa, drier than normal, mostly in the eastern half of Southern Africa, limited impact in the west. Move on to 97, which was the big one, when the El Niño is the second largest on record in OND, and the IOD was the first. That was the strongest IOD we've seen. You can see by these deep blue colors in East Africa, that was a very, very wet season over a large region of East Africa. Nearly every single location saw a significant wet season. In the south, in Southern Africa, it was dry, but patches of wet. We can look down here in Mozambique, in southern Mozambique, and there was a relatively large patch of wetter than normal conditions, despite the El Niño, with the dry stretching a little bit, but there was a larger area of dry stretching further west. Let's go on. Let's look at 2015. This was the big one. This, according to this data and this metric, this was the biggest El Niño event. But the IOD was the sixth largest. So compared to 97, the El Niños were about the same magnitude, but the IOD was much weaker. And if you look over East Africa, you don't see the same huge rainfall anomaly. In fact, that 2015 season was more moderate than expected, with large areas over the bimodal area of Ethiopia and in northern Somalia, Somaliland, and parts of Kenya. Actually, it was drier than average. There were significant wet areas, particularly in Kenya and in Western Kenya, in Tanzania, but it wasn't a huge wet season like 97. But on the contrary, Southern Africa was very dry, largely in the west, but the dry signal did extend over almost to the west coast of Africa. But those really strong negative anomalies were significant all over the eastern side of Southern Africa, without almost any point showing normal or near or above normal rainfall. So that large El Nino had a really strong impact in 2015 on Southern Africa, but the IOD was not as strong. So we understand that because the IOD wasn't as strong, it didn't have that same wet influence on East Africa as we saw in 97. And now there's a gap here, which I've included another year, not a strong El Nino year, but a strong IOD year, which was 2019. Just to illustrate, 2019, there was really no strong ENSO El Nino to speak of. It was the 14th largest on season in that 40-year record. So it was a positive event, but it wasn't strong. But the IOD was strong. The IOD was the second largest on record, and it emerged relatively independently without a strong El Nino. And the rainfall impacts were striking. We saw a very, very wet Eastern Africa, and actually we saw quite a dry Southern Africa, particularly in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and northern Botswana, and northern Mozambique as well. So this just to illustrate that it's the IOD there in East Africa which really seems to drive the rainfall. So we can, if the IOD responds, then we can expect that the chance of a wet season has really increased. Okay, now what are the forecasts saying? I will speed up a little because I'm at 22 minutes. I said I'd do 25, but I think this is important. So what do we expect? What's happening right now? So El Nino conditions are alerted in the Pacific Ocean. It seems from the last time I looked at it, the atmosphere is not quite responding fully. So this is why the Bureau of Meteorology, who issued this alert, they're still on an alert phase. The last time I checked, they haven't fully progressed to an El Nino phase, but all of the models are pointing in that condition. And this map here is showing the global temperatures where these brown and red are warmer than normal. So you can see there's it looks pretty brown and pretty red over a lot of areas. So it's warm. The forecast for El Nino, we can look here at the multi-model from IRI, which is showing the big red lines here. The big red bars are showing the chance that will be an El Nino in that particular season. And they're hovering around 95% through to the end of the year. And so by the first 3 months of next year, there's still an 80% chance we'll still be an El Nino. So odds are El Nino is here, it's coming, and it's here to stay through to at least next year when the picture becomes more uncertain. How strong is it going to be is another question. So this is difficult to say. What we're showing here is we can see these forecasts where you can see the time along the bottom. This dashed line shows the observed state up to June and then July, and each of those red lines is an equally likely evolution of El Nino, and they're all increasing. So that's the basis on which we believe that the El Nino will continue to develop through to the end of the year. But exactly how strong it is, which is shown by the height of the line, is really unclear. It could be each of those lines is equally likely, and they're ranging, as you can see, for the end of the year. It could be, for say in December, it could be a 1.5 anomaly, which is a moderately strong El Nino, or it could be over a 3-degree anomaly, which would be an unprecedented El Nino. We can see the 2015 and 97 events there with that dashed line, around 2.5. And most of the members, most of those simulations are saying it's not going to be as strong as that, but it's still quite close. But there is a real plausible possibility that it could be stronger in those events. My understanding of the latest is that it's about 20% chance of matching those events and stronger. But certainly a 2-degree El Nino would be massive, and that in all likelihood it's looking to be that level or at least above. Now, what can we say about rainfall is one thing. We saw those particular impacts on East African rainfall, IOD, and Southern African rainfall, but then we haven't talked about temperature too much. And I mean, this is something which personally is worrying me quite a lot. If you look at the current global temperatures, I mean, people in Europe and in other places, particularly in Southern Europe, will be well aware of this, that there's significant heat waves currently happening. And that's not isolated, it's happening across the world right now. And we can look at how warm the world is right now. And it's really shocking. I mean, I hope you can see, I'll explain this graph, but to me, this graph is shocking. This is showing the global ocean temperature for the recent historical record since 1981. Each of those lines is showing the evolution of temperature across a single year from 1981 through to the present. You can see 2022 as this orange line here, and the 2022 was particularly hot. But you can see that black one is where we are now. And there is an absolutely massive gap between how warm it is now and the last warmest year. So but El Niño hasn't really started yet. And El Niño pushes the Earth into a warmer state. El Niño has been ramping up and it has been warmer in the Pacific, but we haven't seen anything starting yet. And it's plausible that this gulf between the last warmest year and now will continue. So the rest of the year, it worries me that the kind of heat wave impacts that we've seen and we're even seeing now are only the beginning. Maybe moving back to the other indicators. So that's the current state of the temperature. We can look at the IOD, showing some forecasts here. These are 3 different forecasts, all of the IOD. The IOD is a bit more difficult to predict than an El Niño, but we're showing here that most of them are indicating the emergence of a positive IOD, and it will be relatively strong. So we're looking at the emergence of a El Niño, possibly strong, and an IOD, positive IOD, possibly strong. So we can look at there are already some global producing centers which are making experimental kind of long lead forecasts. I understand ICPAC are making a long lead forecast imminently. So, but this is just a global picture. And we can look ahead to October to December on the left for rainfall and November to January for rainfall as well. And consistent with our understanding of drivers, El Niño, positive IOD, East Africa is looking like a large chance of above normal in October to December, and for moving into January, dry in Southern Africa. And this forecast is suggesting that it's actually a stronger signal in the center west of Southern Africa compared to the east, unlike previous events. But we have to keep an eye on these kind of forecasts. And these 2 plots on the right here are showing the same time periods, but for temperature. And you can see those deep red colors are saturated. They need more color bars on this, but they're showing at least 70% chance of an above normal hot season. And it's most likely those are way above 70% chance for some locations. So not for East Africa during the season, because there's a relationship between rainfall and temperature. When it rains, when it's a very wet season, that tends to suppress the temperature. But certainly for Southern Africa, it's looking like potentially a very dry and a very hot season. But before I finish up, I would say that these seasonal forecasts, we're showing probabilities here, and I'm talking about wet and hot, but these are not a sure thing. The typical risk, we're talking about above normal, normal, and below normal. And the typical risk pattern we have is there's an equal chance of each of those categories. This is shown by you spin the wheel and you win depending, or you lose depending on where the spinner ends. And typically each of those categories there's an equal area, equal chance of each of those. And if we look at this forecast for East Africa right now, looking for the end of the year, most of that region suggests a 60% chance of above normal. And that corresponds to changing the areas on that wheel. So now there's suddenly there's a almost doubled size of chance of a wet, but there's still chance of a normal or dry. So what do you think you would get if you spun that wheel? That's the picture we look at when we have a seasonal forecast. Are you going to put all of your money on wet? Are you going to say that there's absolutely no chance of dry? It would be maybe foolhardy to do so. Certainly we need to prepare for wet, and the chance of a wet has massively increased, but we shouldn't discount the other impacts. I mean, we can have a live demonstration of this, where we have this wheel here. We can actually spin this wheel and see what we get. This could be the forecast for this season, and this what it spins on. I'm not guaranteeing the spinner will be reality, but you might think about where do you think it's going to land. I could ask you to place your bets now, and we see in this case it was wet, so it did turn it on. We could spin it again. We could spin it again, and in this case it was wet again. So it seems like this is good forecast. I don't know how this thing works, it's completely random, but you could see there's still a reasonable chance that we could get into a dry season. I'm not sure why this is stopped working. Anyway, back to the slides. Now, so the point I'm trying to make is that it's not a sure thing, but we are seeing that, when the seasonal forecast is showing these enhanced risks, then we might expect that wet. But what should we do with those? What I'm trying to say is they're only the beginning. They really give a heads up, and they should help people prepare and get ready for those kind of impacts. But they're the ready side. They told you to get ready, but there are other forecasts produced by ITPAC and by other providers which are providing outlooks for mid-range, so for a few weeks or longer ahead, often driven by the MJO, where there's predictability. And then there's go, which is a shorter range forecast. So with that ready, set, go, you might, with a seasonal forecast, that might trigger you to begin the monitoring of those shorter range forecasts. Make sure your plans are in place, train volunteers, sensitize a community. Depending on your sector, you might have different actions. And then that could be a seasonal forecast. And then a mid-range forecast, where you might start to take some more definitive actions. Once for instance, if a seasonal forecast is wet, you might start monitoring this, which is a flood forecast. This is from a global system. This is showing the height of a river forecast over the next few weeks, over the next month. Based on that forecast, you expect the season to be wet, so you keep an eye on this forecast, and this forecast starts to show you there's a chance that the river is going to increase. So maybe you start to warn the community. You don't evacuate people. We're still not sure when it's going to happen, but there's some activities you can take now that it's on the horizon. And then you keep looking at that, and then you might actually trigger that evacuation or the real expensive intervention based on a shorter term forecast, such as this from Kenya Met Department issuing heavy rain advisories for the next few days. That might be a trigger. We've evaluated some of this particular forecast and shown that they are very good at anticipating significant rain events. But that forms part of the whole trigger system. So we're not just the seasonal forecast and those big climate drivers giving us the heads up and the picture and the big context, but it has to be joined up. It has to be joined up in a seamless way from the seasonal to the sub-seasonal through to the short range forecasts. And I'll end there, a little bit over time, but thanks for your attention. And I'm happy to let the other panelists have their input and continue the discussion. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dave. That is really interesting, this presentation there. Very interesting information. we've learned a lot on what really happens when we talk of El Niño, when we talk of La Niña, when we talk of IOD, Madden Julian Oscillation. I remember during the March to May season, everyone was like, where is the rains from? And when we were trying to explain that it's Madden Julian Oscillation, people are like, so what is that? So I think we now get a better understanding of these drivers and what really causes rains. We can also see that MZO is specifically visible, especially from week to week, depending on the phases that the MZO is in. And therefore, we are able to really understand when we get rains and when we don't get rains. And specifically, when you talk of seasonal forecasting, it's just the beginning. I really like that statement because most of the time you issue a 2-month lead forecast. For example, we're going to give an October to December forecast in October to December forecast in August, and people are going to run away with that. They won't want to know what's happening by September, by October, by November, and all that. So we have to look at how the season is evolving from each month and even every week as the season progresses. So, we've also seen how different years where we had El Niño and IOD, different phases of it happening, and what really happened in terms of how much rainfall was received, especially in Eastern Africa. We've seen 2015 was the highest ranked index of Indian ENSO, but the rainfall received was not as much as the one received in 1997, despite the index of ENSO being second rank. And we compared that with the index ranking for the IOD, and we can really see that IOD has some significant impact despite of what El Niño index we're having. So thank you very much for that. And that helps us now to switch gears into the impacts, and we're bringing in our two other panelists. We have Yag around and Brenda. So I'll start with Yag, having a lot of experience and working with IFRC, and that means that you also work specifically with the national societies. And we find that these drivers, especially El Niño and IOD, causing El Niño, La Niña, and IOD causing extreme impacts, especially when we talk of excess rainfall or a deficit in deficit in rainfall causing flooding and drought respectively. So as IFRC, what are some of the challenges that you face in terms of responding to these extreme events when they happen? So what are some of the challenges, especially in the past, that you've been facing, and what are the opportunities that you see? We realize that every challenge comes up with an opportunity. So what are these challenges and opportunities that as IFRC and by extension national societies face when handling these situations?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Yeah, so from the IFRC side, I must say I'm the IFRC regional ENSO interaction coordinator, and I work with national societies to develop their ENSO interaction plans, or as we call them internally, early action protocols. And we have quite a bit in place over the last years in Africa, and East Africa and Southern Africa. For example, this year we have quite a bit of drought protocols already either being active or nearly finalized in Southern Africa. So for example, Zimbabwe is in place, and we have Mozambique in place, and in Madagascar we're working on drought EAP as well. And Namibia, for example, so we're really closely monitoring these situations with the national societies to see if the trigger will be reached. And of course, in Zimbabwe, we already have some low regret trigger that we have actually reached or about to be reached, where certain like no regret and lower cost activities can be done already. Some of the challenges that we face in Eastern and Southern Africa is also the translation of the forecast. So making sure that, and this is two-directional, right? So we have Typically, a mandate is the Red Cross also to have that last mile service delivery. So to making sure what does it actually mean, to translate also probabilities is quite, as you saw in the presentation of Dave, it's quite difficult, right? And you can't go to every community with a spinning wheel, but you have to make sure that it's in language that is understood, and it works two ways, because what are in the end then the impacts of this increased rainfall? And you already, Dave also already alluded to that when it comes to, let's say, riverine floods in Eastern Africa. That's something we can predict. So we also have to make sure that the impact is, and if we predict impacts under anticipatory action, that these are actually predictable, the ones that are relevant for communities. So that's one thing, and it's quite a large scale. That's another big challenge, I would say, with when it comes to anticipatory action and activating the protocols. Right, we are mostly national. We have national protocols, so and sometimes also there we need to align within the nation or within member states with other actors that are also potentially activating already early their protocols. So I think cross-border impacts are something that I4C is really interested in, to have more of a regional approach, and to see also legislative-wise, but also with different protocols, that the alignment can happen properly. What we've seen in the last years now with regional anticipatory action working groups is that coordination and collaboration is quite advanced, and specifically in IGAD and Southern Africa, where we already now in the beginning of the El Niño season are looking with other organizations, where do we have the protocols that are already mapped in a roadmap that we've developed, and how can we make sure that we jointly activate geographically, the distribution is the division is done properly, but also technically. So I'll keep it at that for now, perhaps, and hand over to you back, or can I also give Gigma, my colleague from the Red Cross Climate Center, briefly the floor to make some additions?
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, I think, thank you very much. And I think Jörg has already said it all. Thank you, Dave, for such a nice presentation. One extra opportunity I may add is that there is, at least for this specific year, there is some kind of publicity around El Niño. So there is some sort of buzz, a good buzz, I would say. I think that at the beginning of the presentation, the moderator was saying that even in her village, communities are already aware that El Niño is coming. I think that this is something good for us, Red Cross, and us humanitarians as a whole, I would say, because actually, if then a given national society, when one goes to the community and actually wants to engage with them, this is made easier because they are already on alert. They're actually now waiting for us to come with sort of the ground truth of what will happen. And in this, I also get back to Jörg's other point in terms of challenge, that is, we need the information for the last man. We need much more stress in terms of what exactly will happen to this specific community. I'm aware of the climate, of the limitations in terms of climate modeling, but this is something which is needed. Even if this is not possible, at least, let's say, a wider scale impact information is also very welcome. So this is a sort of invite to the national and regional meteorological services to work more in terms of delivering to us, humanitarians, and also directly to communities, more impact-based forecast information. And with this, I will end over back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I must agree with you that we really need much of impact-based forecast rather than probabilities that you cannot tell your grandfather that we have 70% chance that the rains will be enhanced. So we really need to do a lot in that. And in terms of ensuring that we act in time, we need collaboration amongst countries. We have cross-border risks, and therefore these collaborations are really an opportunity that will help us to work on this. So thank you very much, and I'm coming over to you, Brenda. Working with FAO. FAO is a humanitarian organization, and I know you have extensive experience with this. You've been able to work with countries that are experiencing these extreme events, whether it's too much flooding, causing displacement, and even loss of lives and livelihoods, and all that, dispersing all the necessary resources that they need. What is your experience like in cases where these extreme events associated with El Nino, La Nina, or even IOD happens, and as FAO, what really do you do differently that cuts you from other organizations? Over to you, Brenda.
Great. Great question. So maybe just starting off. So I've been in the region for about 5 years now. So I've seen a variety of different crises affect the region. So from a climatic standpoint, I've seen the 3-year drought across the Horn of Africa. I've seen the 4 years of flooding across South Sudan, the severe desert locust upsurge, and I've seen a variety of other hazards, COVID-19, conflict, macroeconomic challenges, and things of that sort. And so I guess maybe first on what the experience is like. I mean, unfortunately, I think these crises right now are really shocking and really heartbreaking. And so just looking at, for example, the Horn of Africa with the most recent drought, in Somalia alone, we saw 43,000 people that died in 2020. So 43,000 excess deaths, and half of those were children under the age of 5. So absolutely heartbreaking. And I think we really need to look hard at ourselves from a humanitarian perspective and see what went wrong with, say, the recent drought, and how can we do things differently in the future. I guess maybe from FAO's side, things that we're really kind of prioritizing to do differently. First of all, I think we're working on how do you do kind of anticipatory action better. And I think that within kind of the anticipatory action world, also from the early warning world, which is very much where my background lies, I think we're really guilty of thinking that, well, if we build a better early warning system, or if we have a better forecast, that's going to then lead to action. And then we're going to have anticipatory action, it's going to be implemented in a timely manner, and that's going to solve all our issues. And I think the reality is, at least in the East Africa region, is we really have good early warning systems already in place. A lot of the work that's being done by ICPAC's excellent. A lot of the work being done by national governments on food security early warning systems, again, are really excellent. And so in most cases, including with the most recent drought, we knew these hazards were coming. And unfortunately, right now, we're really having difficulties with linking those early warning systems to anticipatory action. So decision makers know when they need to act, and they need to know exactly how they should be acting, and also ensuring that funding is available at the right time. I think that like I said, I think the recent drought emergency has really illustrated some of the major failings that we've had, both from a humanitarian perspective, but also an anticipatory action perspective. And so I think we need to really think about what lessons learned can we take from some of these recent drought emergencies and from some also flood emergencies, and how can we do better on anticipatory action? I guess a couple of other things I would highlight. One, I think there's challenges still with really upscaling both anticipatory action, but also other resilience climate adaptation programs in the region. I think we're very guilty in thinking that pilot projects and fairly small scale funding is going to have a major macro impact on the region, reversing food security trends. And the reality is these projects are just way too small to have those impacts, that they may have impacts at a very local level, but we're not going to see reversing food security trends when you have these small scale projects. And so we really need to be working on institutionalizing anticipatory action, and also working on really investing in what works. And so I think it's very clear what works right now. And I think we need to be seeing large scale investments to really upscale a lot of these programs that work and really see a change. I guess the last one, and this was something that's already been mentioned, just I think the importance of successful collaborations. And so I think we're often kind of guilty of kind of working within our mandates, working within our silos. And I think that if we kind of break that and we collaborate closely with other partners, I think we can have larger impacts. And so as mentioned earlier, I co-lead the Regional Food Security and Nutrition Working Group along with EGAD. And I think that we've had some success stories there with the recent drought emergency. We've published joint, timely, multi-sectoral alerts, working not just with food security and nutrition experts, but also working with climate experts, health experts, WASH experts, protection and GBV experts. And I think sending one kind of clear message across all the different sectors, I think was quite powerful, and I think something that can be quite helpful. And so I think seeing how do we kind of build off of these successful collaborations and how do we keep these collaborations going with upcoming hazards, I think are quite important. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there. I'll pass it back over to you. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you very much, Brenda. Breaking silos. It's time that we really action on breaking silos, because it's always on paper that in order for us to work well and effectively during using the resources that we have, we need to break silos. And I think your example of FSNWG is really a good one, that we've been able to collaborate as different institutions. We've been able to really do much, and we are getting to do things differently. And having to do proper anticipatory action really is one of the main key things of ensuring that we break the repeated disasters that come, like even though we have enough early warning information, we still get the impacts. So I'll switch now again to Yak before I come to Dave. Early this month, we had the 6th African Climate Dialogue Platform, and there were lots of discussion on AA, and we realized that different people are doing different things, and very interesting things across the continent. So we just want to get a brief understanding, maybe in 2 minutes, tell us what is the landscape like of anticipatory action like in both Eastern and Southern Africa, or specifically areas that you're well conversant with, and how is IFRC specifically promoting integrating of these anticipatory actions in policy frameworks and every other protocols that are in countries? You mentioned previously that there are protocols that are already up and running. So how are you specifically working to promote integrating of these in every country so that we all come to the same level? And you already mentioned some of the successes in some countries. Would you kindly tell us what are some of the lessons that you learned from those success stories?
Thanks, that's a big question. So yeah, from my side, I would say to start with, a couple of years ago in Southern Africa, we were trying to engage with SADC, the regional economic community, through, indeed, as Brenda is highlighting here as well, this more siloed approach, right? We even called anticipatory action differently between agencies, like early warning, early action, forecast-based financing. So I think there was also a little bit of a government fatigue in kind of new approaches. So there was actually really a call from SADC to say, okay, humanitarian development actors, get your act together and coordinate and collaborate before you engage with us. So that's exactly what we did. The IFRC, the FAO, and WFP, we started this regional anticipatory action working group, RAAG, so RAAWG, in Southern Africa with SADC. And we developed a roadmap, and we launched that during the last ministerial conference on early warning and early action in Maputo. One of the major outputs there, and one of the vision statements for that roadmap is that anticipatory action is fully integrated within the DRM continuum and within the DRM legal policies and landscapes within all member states in SADC. And for that, of course, you need a lot of advocacy. So advocacy efforts from the Regional Anticipatory Action Working Group, joining regional economic communities in different platforms and ensuring that anticipatory action terminology is aligned and this roadmap is fully understood. We really realized that these regional coordination platforms in Eastern and Southern Africa, similar, we are setting one up in IGAD region with WFP and ICPAC and FAO as well. And we'll have a rotating basis of secretariat there as well. But the regional coordination is something also that is fully integrated and recognized in, let's say, this early warning for all initiative, that these regional coordination mechanisms are essential for all the different pillars when it comes to effective early warning systems. Yeah, so basically, there are a couple of steps that are highlighted within this Southern Africa roadmap for now, where there is that alignment needed on anticipatory actions. So for that, we need to develop a database of actions, and we've started to work now under an ECHO-funded program, also jointly with WFP and FAO. A trigger database to align triggers to make sure that we can jointly activate and that it's purely government-led. And financing, of course. So financing, alignment, and mainstreaming of different financing agency-specific mechanisms versus more alternative funding. And then, of course, the advocacy, the evidence-based advocacy. So more and more, we're also working towards generating clear-cut kind of cost-benefit analyses for anticipatory action, for government, for regional economic communities. This was a clear ask from EGAD as well. And that's something we can definitely support on, and we should fill those knowledge gaps towards the future. Did I answer all your questions? I'm a bit fluish today, so my brain might not be fully functioning.
That's well understandable. Maybe what are some of the key lessons, apart from what you've mentioned, that you've learned from countries that have had working protocols?
Ah, yes. So from the activations, well, let me first start maybe with anticipatory action is often seen as a very operational mechanism. But before you come to an operational mechanism, you need to have a lot of systems building. Really building and working with Met agencies, with the disaster management authorities to make sure that you design and you have that ownership within anything that you design. So from triggers to impacts to selection of hazard, and making sure that the capacity is there. You don't have the same level of Met agency in every data, the same level of risk and vulnerability information or historical impact databases. So that systems building and filling those gaps technologically, equipment-wise, etc. That's a huge investment. One of the lessons learned is to really have a joint setup. So basically, if you have staff to maybe second staff to a Met agency, really invest in that and have it also clearly described what are the cost benefits of a functioning Met agency. That is something really important in different member states because they're really underfunded, and their value is really not seen often. With regards to operational experience, we've activated multiple full anticipatory action plans, specifically also in Mozambique. We've been working in Mozambique since 2015 on floods and cyclones. What we saw there, it's the limitations are, of course, with fast onset, more the window period. So for cyclones, we had 72 hours. For floods, we have 48 hours. And logistically, this is quite a challenge. Coordination with government was a big lessons learned up into the district level to make sure that anticipatory action plans and the actions are disseminated properly. This can really depend. This can really make or break the success of your activation. We had an example where logistically we were very strong, but there was not enough coordination, collaboration with localized authorities. Whereas, are you activating for a flood? Where is the flood? You're creating maybe more panic than that you're contributing here, right? So this is this is something that alignment, dissemination to localized authorities is essential. I can go on. I mean, there is a lot of technological work going on behind the scenes with different data models when it comes to impact-based forecasts. But for that, you need to know what is the most important impact of a community that you're trying to predict. Is it, let's say, washed away houses, or is it crops that will be destroyed? And that depends really on the community to inform what is necessary to have predicted. You can build a beautiful model, but it's not up to the region or to the national scale, national level to assume what the most affected impacts will be in communities. So I think those are highlights that I would want to give, at least for fast onset. We have very limited experience yet with activating for slow onset. So perhaps I could hand over to FAO for that as well, unless Gigma, you want to still have a contribution here.
Maybe I could elaborate a little bit on the first component of the question, which was related to how do we as IFRC work to actually promote anticipatory action. I think that we have several national societies that we are supporting. We have a real growth of the interest of national societies in doing anticipatory action. Apart from that, and we call that in last year's anticipatory dialogue platform, Africa Dialogue Platform in Kenya at ICPAC, I would say, one of the key points we discussed was the institutionalization, how we get the regional economic communities, but also the national governments to actually take the lead in anticipatory action. And I'm happy to say that we as movement, as Red Cross, we have been able, for example, to support the government of Sierra Leone to kind of embrace anticipatory action and actually institutionalize it. So it is now, there is an anticipatory action protocol that has been adopted by the government of Sierra Leone as a working document for that country. So I think that this is something that will also be promoted across Eastern and Southern Africa. And I'm sure that in the next couple of years, anticipatory action will be fully integrated in the disaster risk management continuum of the region.
Great. We have limited time and a lot of information to share. So to just pick on the roadmaps that have been prepared by the different regions and the need for operationalization and having anticipatory action led by governments and mainstreaming financing, you can have the best procedures, the best of everything. But if you don't have the right financing or sufficient financing, you'll be as good as you didn't start. So we really hope that we are able to, as governments, national governments, be able to take up this and ensure that with support from everyone, all this anticipatory action and activation of financing and everything is able to happen to ensure that we save lives and livelihoods when we have disasters. So let's now switch gears to Dave. We're coming back to you with there are participants who would like to get more understanding of, I think they came in late or they got lost somewhere. So what is La Niña and what is El Niño, what is MJO and all that? And how do they affect onset? And I'll give you 2 minutes to do that very briefly, and then people can get to follow up with their questions to your inbox or to your emails. You'll be able to share your details. And before you answer that, I want you to combine the rest of that short response with any advances that we have in forecasting these drivers. We realize that we know what they are now by most people, and after you explain that, we'll know what they are. And what are the advances that we've made in forecasting them to help us understand more on its impacts for both East and Southern Africa. And to wrap up, that is currently the focus that you showed us on IOD and ENSO specifically. It was showing high chances of up to 90 or 95% that we are getting a strong El Nino. Does it really mean that we're going to get a lot of rainfall or even extreme droughts in the south? Okay. Over to you.
Many thanks. Okay, let's see. 3 questions. What are the drivers, and then what are the advances in forecasting those, and then what is the outlook for this season? Well, in 2 minutes. So El Nino and La Nina are 2 sides of the same coin. So the coin is called ENSO. So the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and it's a phenomenon in the climate system which moves between a positive phase for several months and even for years, and then it flips back to neutral phase, and then it goes to a negative phase. And we call the positive phase El Nino, and we call the negative phase La Niña. So we're currently moving into an El Nino phase, and in an El Nino phase that has a typical pattern of impacts across the world. In East Africa, El Nino tends to be associated with wet, short rains. In Southern Africa, it tends to be associated with dry. Mentioned MJO there. So MJO is the Madden Julian Oscillation. And this is a phenomenon which moves much quicker than El Nino. ENSO is moving on a month-to-month timescale, evolving slowly, like an elephant moving slowly. But MJO is much quicker, as much like a tiger or a lion or something. It moves between from week to week. It evolves in a more quicker way, and it moves. So MJO is an organized system of rainfall that moves in the tropics eastwards. So it sometimes suppresses and it's sometimes active. And when it moves across Africa, that's associated with rainfall. And when it's gone past Africa, there's a tail of dry. And when that dry part passes over Africa, that tends to suppress rainfall. So based on where the MJO is and where it's active or suppressed, we have some idea of whether a particular week period is a week-to-week variability, whether that's going to be wetter or drier than normal. How that relates to onset? In general, if an MJO would be to occur, if an active MJO was in the right place at the right time, near the time of onset, it could add a whole bunch of extra rainfall. It could increase the chance of rainfall, and it could bring an onset earlier. Let's say if the onset is normally occurring in mid-March, and then suddenly in early March, there's a big active MJO in zone 2 or 3. That could bring a whole load of rainfall, which could effectively bring the onset of the rainfall, the season earlier. But in the same way, if the onset is normally in mid-March, but actually in that period, mid to late March, it transitioned to the zone 5, 6, 7 of MJO, that could suppress the rainfall and actually delay the onset. So in a general sense, we expect it to have a kind of complex and case-to-case effect on onset. It's difficult to give it's not a simple relationship. I hope that's clear. I'm happy to share those slides afterwards to understand the drivers. In terms of advances in drivers, in predicting the drivers themselves, there's continuous work always to improve climate models. And as climate models improve with more resolution and improved processes, we expect, we've seen over history as they've improved, as they've got more detailed and higher resolution, and those things like a prediction of El Nino gets better. So we might expect as they continue to improve, we see these gradual improvements. But there may be other more innovative ways. Someone mentioned AI in the chat, artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is starting to take a role in weather forecasting in different ways, from just post-processing of output to make it more spatially detailed, to even AI models which are completely run by AI and have no traditional climate model running. Some of those are in development, and their possibility is completely unknown. They could represent you may have played with ChatGPT or these other language models who suddenly these advances in AI are amazing. Their impact on weather forecasting is yet unknown. They're just coming out. It could be that they lead to huge jumps in our ability to predict MJO. We don't know yet. That's in flux. So that's something to keep an eye on. And then finally, to turn to the final point, which is the current forecast, it's looking like a very strong chance of an El Niño. It's almost dead cert that the El Niño will continue through to the end of the year. But El Niño is not always associated with flooding. It's not, the relationship is not completely one-to-one. So if there's a 90% chance of El Niño, that doesn't mean there's a 90% chance of flooding, of rainfall. To get an idea of the rainfall, we have to look at the output from the seasonal forecast models, such as ICPAC is producing, and keep your eye out for the long-range forecast, which should be out imminently. But the other global models, which have already started to produce those long lead outputs, are suggesting it is an increased chance of wet. So the chance of a wet OND in East Africa and a dry Southern Africa is larger than normal. The chance is larger than normal, but it's not as high as 90%. They're currently looking around 60 or 70%. That will evolve over time. So I would say, you know, it is as someone mentioned about fortune telling in the chat, which is quite interesting. But I would say it's forecasting. No one knows the future with 100% accuracy. Anyone who tells you they know the future with 100% accuracy is lying to you. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it's absurd to be certain. So we have to live with uncertainty. But there are some situations, like when there is an El Niño event, that we know that the risk has shifted. The chance of these kind of hazards is larger than normal, and it would be a mistake not to be ready for it.
Interesting. 90% chance of a strong El Niño does not mean 90% chance of rainfall. And that brings up the question to both Brenda and Yag. Early warning information is out. The forecast for El Niño came as early as May. As a humanitarian organization, as FAO, we've talked of anticipatory action. We don't want to go back to the traditional way of responding to events, just in case extreme events happen. It's 2 months away from the start of the short rain season. What is FAO doing at the moment, given this early warning information? Over to you, Brenda.
Great question. So we've been doing a lot. We've actually been quite busy the last month or so working on El Niño response. I guess, first of all, on the advocacy side, so FAO as well as FSNWG, which I noted earlier is FAO co-leads with EGAD, have been doing a lot of work on basically educating decision makers about the El Niño, about likely impacts in the region, both in western areas of the region, which I feel like haven't been highlighted as much in today's discussion, but there is an increased probability of below average rains across parts of western parts of the region, such as northern Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, but then also looking at the eastern parts of the region that are at risk of floods. I would say in the last week alone, I've probably done briefings at over a dozen different forums about El Niño impacts, briefing donors, briefing UN and NGO partners, the various clusters, not even just food security, but also WASH Health, as well as national governments. And so a lot of work's been done to date by FAO on the advocacy side. Beyond that, on the anticipatory action side, so we're doing a variety of different things. Already, so FAO has basically an internal funding mechanism to kickstart anticipatory action programs. And so we've already released funds to kickstart anticipatory action programs relating to flooding in Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda. And so those programs are getting started up right now. We're opening projects and we will be implementing those programs soon. And so that's kind of intended to start the programs. That said, I mean, we only have a limited amount of funding within our internal mechanism. So that's only kind of intended to be seed money to get the activities going. And that while we look for additional funding to upscale these projects. In addition to that, I would highlight that at the regional level, so we're just finalizing a note right now, basically outlining our approach to the El Niño response at the regional level. I'd be happy to provide, if anyone's interested, additional details on this, but basically we're kind of planning on working within kind of 3 different areas. One, and another thing that I think hasn't been highlighted so much is, in addition to flooding, above average rains outside of floodplain areas will actually be really good, particularly for drought affected households. You see generally with above average rainfall years, you see a decrease in food security outcomes. You generally see increases in crop production. The issue is with a lot of these drought affected households, they have very little resources to invest in inputs and to invest in their production. And so we're looking to basically provide support to households, particularly outside of these flood-prone areas, to basically enable drought-affected households to really take advantage of the favorable rains to come and hopefully help support drought recovery. In addition to that, in the flood-prone areas, we're doing a variety of work to basically help reduce flooding as well as protect assets. This is including things like rehabilitating broken river embankments, consolidating dikes, desilting, water canals, things of that sort. Also, you tend to see an increase in livestock diseases during years of above average rains, particularly given that livestock are already in poor condition with the recent drought. So working on upscaling animal health programs. And then finally, another option for particularly flood affected households, which I don't think has been really touched on, is yes, often households see severe crop losses during the flood event, but there's also a lot of opportunities for flood recession agriculture right after. And if we time our programs right, and if we have the resources there at the right time, we can also take advantage of flood recession agriculture in many of these areas, and at least enable households to have some type of harvest. So that's kind of our approach right now. So like I said, if anyone's interested in that approach, I'd be happy to share additional details later. Thanks so much.
Great, very elaborate preparation there, and we hope that everything will be handled on time. And now I switch to Yag with the same question. You have this early warning information. So what are you doing?
I won't keep it. I won't make it as long as Brenda. I won't repeat certain things. A lot has been said, but of course, you know, like, within the Red Cross movement, we have this disaster relief emergency fund within the IFRC for national societies, and they can access this fund through having an early action protocol or anticipatory action plan. I use those terms interchangeably in place to access this funding. I'm sorry, was there a comment? Yeah.
Sorry,
okay, so within these protocols, right, because we have often, actually always, we have a nationwide approach when it comes to floods. And within these protocols, when it comes to these kind of climate outlook information sources, these are now taken up in the planning season. For example, for floods, it's often the case that we pre-position stocks, right? And the location where those stocks need to be pre-positioned is often a little bit of a question. And if kind of like regional outlook forums are translated to the national context, we often see like, okay, so in the northern part, the rainfall will be above average. So for floods, we start planning the stock increasingly in that area. Of course, it's always a risk. It's always a probability, I mean, but those kind of efforts you can envision. So really on a national scale, making sure that our warehouses are stocked in the right locations. Other than that is also improving the dissemination of anticipatory action mechanism up until the branch level, and that's really our localized level of the Red Cross within a national context. Other than that, the same as Brenda, but I'm more and more try to do this interagency and collaboratively with other humanitarian partners in the country or on a regional level to make sure that we brief our country offices or national societies on what to expect and what type of internal financing mechanisms our national societies have access to during that period. And next to, having a full anticipatory action plan in place, we also have a simplified version of that and an imminent one that we can still finance if there is not a fully fledged protocol or mechanism in place. So I'll keep it at that. Gigma, did you have any corrections? Did you have any additions?
Not a correction for sure, just an addition. We know that the extremes that we may see will always come and face another already existing, let's say, political situation. And you know that in some parts of Eastern Africa and even Southern Africa, Northern Mozambique, for example, we have some ongoing conflicts there. So as Red Cross, we are also working with the movement component, which is mostly focusing on these conflict areas to see what can be done also for these communities, because they shouldn't be left out of the anticipatory action work that we are doing. And for that, we're having a couple of activities with ICRC, which is the component of the Red Cross movement working mostly in conflict settings. So we're working with them to actually see what can also be done in each of these communities that are affected by conflict, and that unfortunately may also be affected by the adverse impacts of the upcoming El Niño and IOD impacts. So this is mostly what we add. In addition, maybe to also add that in Eastern Africa in particular, we know that the region has been plagued by drought over the last 5 to 6 consecutive seasons. So it is important, and as we work with them, to actually take into consideration this state of vulnerability. There is an increased vulnerability, and we really need to act with the branches to see what actions we are going to do that will help them not suffer an extra vulnerability as a result of a completely different climate pattern that may affect them.
Our region is prone to different hazards, cascading, multi, and it makes handling all this very difficult. And we try our best to ensure that we handle them as much as we can to save lives and livelihoods. That is great. So thank you very much. We are stealing 2 minutes of your time. We promised to end this at 3:30. And I think most of the questions have been answered online. Most people who asked have gotten their responses. And if you have specific questions that you feel that it should be answered, don't shy away to send it to us. Send it to our panelists. Our panelists, I would like to request you to kindly put your emails on the chat so that participants are able to follow up with you on especially the presentations that you made, to ask more questions and even get the presentations that you sent. We'll be able to send this to people who registered, and you'll be able to get to the presentation by Dave. If we have any other information, Brenda hinted that she is free to share some other information. We'll be able to share this, and we kindly ask you to register, subscribe to our mailing list, and this will be very easy for us to send you all these presentations. So we're coming to an end of our webinar today. We've had very, very interesting discussions. We first thank the panelists for sparing time to share their massive experiences with us. I'm very sure that most of us have learned a lot. We've learned about anticipatory actions, especially for people who are in science. We have come to learn about this, and it's really good to be all around. As you issue the forecast, you realize that it is until you give an impact-based forecast that it will really help someone who is supposed to act on that forecast. And we're really getting to learn a lot about that. So thank you very much to everyone who was able to spare time to be with us for this 1.5 hours. We really appreciate that you're able to do away with other plans and be able to come and listen to these discussions and share your experiences with us. We are coming again to you with other webinars in future, and we hope that we'll be able to get more interactions with you. All our social media pages, we have our website where you can send us feedback and requests. we are open for discussions. Thank you very much for being with us. See you next time. My name is Eunice Koyes. I've been your moderator for today. Thank you all and bye-bye.